Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the Climate Museum and at Talking Climate, where once every month we convene a remarkable group of experts to talk about themes at the intersection of climate and inequality. Huge thanks to the Mellon Foundation for making this work possible, and also an additional thanks to you for not only joining us today, but for bearing with us as we work through the technical glitches that YouTube has been experiencing this week and switched over to Zoom. I also want to thank our amazing production team at TinyCast, Chanko and Scott Sledgister, for making this transition happening smoothly, at least on our side, and I hope it felt smooth to you guys as well. We are here to talk about the law, and I'll have more to say on that in just a moment. But first, I want to alert you to the fact that we have a celebrated poet who will be performing a wonderful poem from a collection called Whereas. Our poet today is Layli Long Soldier, and the poem is called Resolution 6. And we think that the performance will be more enriching if you're also reading the poem. So we're now about to drop a link to that poem into the chat. And if you want to get that ready so that you can follow along as Layli is performing the poem in a couple of minutes, that would be fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about the house rules. This will just take 10 seconds. The basic idea of the house rules is just to please be as interactive as possible, chat with each other, ask questions of the panelists, tag a specific panelist if you want a question directed to them. These questions will be brought back around to the back end by the Climate Museum team, and we will work them into the discussion as much as is possible. We've had very lively chats and very lively question asking in the past, and we anticipate that will continue today. In just a moment, I'll ask you, Felicia, to bring the panelists over to join me here. But first, I want to encourage everyone who's listening to join me in acknowledging that we sit and stand on unceded Indigenous lands and territories, and to honor the leaders past, present, and emergent in those communities and nations. Land acknowledgements are increasingly common in American cultural institutions and American life in general. They are the beginning, not the end, of an inquiry that we invite everyone to make. And there are more resources on Indigenous tribal rights and treaty rights in the resources document that you'll have access to after the show. It's profoundly enriching to dig into those resources, and I highly recommend it on a personal note. And now to introduce our incredible cast of characters for the day. I'll go alphabetically by last name. First, Vic, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. Vic Barrett is an organizer with the Alliance for Climate Education and is also one of the plaintiffs in the famous case Youth v. Gov, or Juliana versus the United States. So we'll be talking a bit about that. He has also just this week been protesting the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota. So we're going to break with our regularly scheduled programming to get into that partway through the show. Also joining us, Amma Francis. Amma, it's wonderful to meet you and also to have you here with us today. Amma is the project strategist for climate displacement at the International Refugee Assistance Project and also a fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, one of those. My apologies. And Brian Kahn, longstanding climate journalist, teacher at Columbia's Climate and Society Master's Program, and currently the managing editor of Earther. I want to give a shout out to Andrea Lust, our wonderful ASL interpreter, and Shirley Ha, who's providing you with closed captioning today, before turning it over to the celebrated poet, Layli Long Soldier, to read Resolution 6, again from the collection Whereas. And this poem is about Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline. So it's particularly pertinent for our discussion today. Thank you so much, Layli, for being here. And everyone, please, if you've uploaded that link, click on over and have a read as you have a listen.
Oh, hi, good afternoon. Layli Kichitahanska, Layli Long Soldier, Imachiapi, Da Yahipi Nachante Washte Nabe Chiuzapi. I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to hearing everyone share this afternoon. Before I read Resolution 6, I wanted to introduce the piece, a little note that is at the back of my book about the making of this. In Resolution 6, the text at the left is from Mark K. Tilson, who is also an Oglala poet and educator from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And that text was taken from one of his Facebook posts in 2016, offering guidelines to the community for how to conduct themselves at camp in Standing Rock. And he was also on the front lines among the people sort of protecting the waterway. And the text at the right of the page is from Wania Locke, who is also a person on the front lines, also a family friend, to be quite honest, from Standing Rock, North Dakota. And that text is taken from an interview that I had with her in 2016 as well. So you will hear me when I've read this before. I've read it with two people, myself and one other person, to represent the two voices, but you'll recognize a little back and forth between the two texts of Mark's post on social media and Wania's interview. So just so you know that that's what's happening. Resolution 6. Excuse me. I too urge the President to acknowledge the wrongs of the United States against Indian tribes in the history of the United States, in order to bring healing to this land. Although healing this land is not dependent, never has been, upon this president, meaning tribal nations and the people themselves are healing this land, its waters, with or without presidential acknowledgement. They act upon this right without apology. To speak to law enforcement, these direct action principles, be really clear, always ask, have been painstakingly drafted. Who, what, when, where, why, at behest of the local leadership. E.g., officer, my name is from Standing Rock. Please explain, and are the guidelines, the probable cause for stopping me. For the Ocheti Shakowin camp, you may ask, I acknowledge a plurality of ways. Does that seem reasonable to you? To resist oppression, don't give any further info. People ask, why do you bring up? We are protectors. So many other issues. It's because we are peaceful and prayerful. These issues, excuse me, These issues have been ongoing. Isms have no place. For 200 years, they're interdependent. Here, we all stand together. We teach the distinction, nonviolent, between civil rights and civil liberties. We are proud to stand between what's legal and what isn't legal. No masks. The camp is 100% volunteer. Respect locals. It's a choice to be a protector. No weapons. Liberty is freedom, or what could be construed as weapons of speech. It's a right. Property damage does not get us closer to privacy, a fair trial, to our goal. You're free. All campers must get an orientation from unreasonable search, direct action training, free from seizure of person or home is required, and civil disobedience. The camp is for everyone taking action, an act of civil disobedience. No children. Now, the law protects the corporation in potentially dangerous situations. So the camp is illegal. We keep each accountable. You must have a buddy system to these principles. Someone must know when you're leaving. This is a ceremony. And when you're coming back, act accordingly. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Layli. Thank you so much for the gift of both writing and performing that poem. Ceremony, acting accordingly, a buddy system on a practical scale and also a cosmic scale, and taking action. We believe in all those things at the Climate Museum. And on the question of taking action, I'll forecast we'll be making an action ask of all of you tuning in at the end of the show. So we're excited to present that in a little while. Just a couple of words before I turn to you, Vic, with a question about your involvement in Youth v. Gov, or Juliana versus the United States. We're not going to be talking that much about formal legal doctrine about climate change law today. In one sense, right now we are dropping into the chat a reference to an upcoming conference that will get very much into all those fascinating dynamics and details for those who are interested. Our perspective today is more that of a sociological. We have a sociological take on the law. So, and by the way, that's not just the random view of climate advocates and their take on the law. One of the most quoted Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who has sat on the Supreme Court for 30 years, has the very famous quote to lawyers, which is the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. There's an entire school called legal realism that's built on this sociological understanding of the law. And so we see the law as a snapshot of where different forces and relationships exist in society at a given moment. But you have to layer onto that it's not a snapshot, because it's constantly in motion, and it includes both intensely coercive and intensely liberatory possibilities, as our history in the United States demonstrates time and time again on both sides of that divide. Right now, as the fossil fuel industry enters its death throes and is fighting for its very existence and pulling on every lever of power, including those it can touch in the legal system to maintain the carbon economy. We're going to see a lot of coercion coming out of that on the legal side. At the same time, the struggle on the climate crisis on every scale, from the civic actions that people take by calling their representatives and talking to their friends, to the activism that happens on the front lines, and that Vic has been engaged in recently, that we'll hear a little bit more about. The liberatory possibilities of the law are also being very intensively mobilized in this moment around questions of climate and inequality. So it's a particularly rich moment for this discussion, and I'm very excited to ask everyone to join me just briefly before I turn to you, Vic, with a really open question, which is just to tell us about Youth v. Gov, or Juliana versus the United States, and your involvement in it, and its promise and its challenges for advancing our interests as a species in the climate crisis.
Yeah, would love to speak to that. So, like Miranda said, I've been a plaintiff on the Juliana versus United States lawsuit since I was 16 years old, I believe. I'm 22 now, so it's been a process, the slow turning wheels of justice. But yeah, basically, Juliana versus the United States was a lawsuit filed in 2015 by 21 young people, including myself, from all over the United States, basically asserting that the United States federal government has violated young people's, our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by perpetuating a fossil fuel energy system. We have an incredible amount of experts, an incredible amount of people supporting us, basically in the knowledge that the United States federal government has known since the 1960s that fossil fuel development and a fossil fuel energy system could contribute to catastrophic climate change. And they still decided to continue that system and prioritize profit over posterity, and create a world in which young people like me, for example, the general consensus is that 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere is what's sustainable for human life. When I was born, actually, I even have it tattooed on my arm here. When I was born, it was 370 parts per million. So we have a bunch of young people who have been born into a world like technically incapable of sustaining their existence. And that's kind of what a lot of the basis for this case is just speaking up for a whole generations of people who didn't get to speak up for themselves when all these decisions were made that really affect our future. I decided to join the lawsuit because when I was in high school, I was doing a lot of like legislative or, trying to talk to politicians, and I couldn't vote. And most of the time I've been a plaintiff on this lawsuit, I couldn't vote. And basically trying to assert the fact that just because I can't vote for you doesn't mean that you're not accountable to me. And I just got tired of going to council members, or I'm from New York, going to New York City council members' offices or crashing their Christmas parties to get them to listen to me. And the Juliana lawsuit really gave me this opportunity to put the cold, hard facts of climate justice of climate change right in front of the U.S. federal government, government that's responsible for a quarter of historic global carbon emissions. So yeah, we've been doing this case for a while. We've had so many wins in the legal system. But it's a system. It's the U.S. legal system. It's complex. But right now, where we're at, like 6 years later, we're going into settlement talks with the Biden administration. Really taking all that evidence that we have, all the facts that we have, and really trying to talk about what the U.S. federal government is supposed to do. And the most recent and interesting, I guess, update is that 17 states have actually filed to stop the settlement conversations, or they want to be involved in the settlement conversations. These are mostly Republican states led by Alabama, in action that's basically trying to kill the Biden administration's chance for settlement. They want to be interveners, so they want to participate in the settlement negotiations, even though they also made it very clear that they will object to any proposed settlement in order to kind of slow down the climate agenda that this administration has in place. So yeah, that's where we're at now, and that's like the briefing I have of the case for now. But yeah.
Thank you for that, and thank you for doing this work. One of the amazing kinds of injustice of the climate crisis is the intergenerational injustice of it, and the fact that the people who literally had nothing to do with causing it, nothing in any way, shape, or form, are currently set to experience its worst consequences. So for you to find the different ways you found to raise your voice against that is profoundly important and inspiring. I also want to make sure that everybody in the audience knows that the Republican Attorney General's Association, which is backed this effort to intervene in the case and shut it down, is heavily funded, you will not be shocked to hear, by the fossil fuel industry. So no surprises there. That's the struggle that we are in on the streets and also in the law. But thank you, Vic, for that really great and concise summary. And Amma, if we could turn to you now to talk about the law of climate displacement, where you're a legal expert and scholar. What are the protections that currently exist for people displaced by the climate crisis, and what changes do we need to see? What would you like to see going forward in terms of how the law addresses that particular intersection of climate and inequality?
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, I want to actually pick up on something that you just said and Vic was saying about the people who are least responsible for climate impacts being the ones that suffer the most. I think that's true whether we're talking about youth or whether we're talking about climate displaced people. Generally, people who are displaced by climate-related disasters are Black and Brown people, either in the US or from countries that are facing severe climate impacts because of the carbon pollution in industrialized countries. So I just think that's important as context for this conversation. And also wanted to pick up on what you said about the law being something that has both liberatory and oppressive potentials. I think we see that dynamic very clearly when it comes to migration. But to answer your question, I guess the short answer is that climate displaced people have growing but limited legal protection. So for people who move across borders because of climate-related disasters or because of climate effects, heat, wildfires, drought, sea level rise, the majority of people are moving within their own countries. And when people move within their own countries, their governments have a responsibility to protect their human rights. That's the good story. The bad story is that often governments actually fail to protect those. So here in the United States, for example, we had 5 indigenous tribes who filed a communication, it's called, with the UN to say that the US government was failing to protect their human rights because they were being forced to move. We have 2 indigenous tribes who have already started the process of moving their entire communities because of the negative impacts of climate change. When it comes to people moving across borders, because there are a small number of people who or a smaller number of people who have to seek shelter in other countries because of climate related impacts. For them, the law is a lot more fuzzy. It's not clear who exactly is responsible for ensuring that those people have protection. And I see this because our system of protection internationally is really set up based on international refugee law. And international refugee law is based on a single convention that was negotiated in the 50s and the 70s when the major sort of threat to human security and livelihoods and well-being was war and political persecution. And so climate really wasn't in the picture at that time. So there's no clear climate category in international refugee law. Generally tends to lead people to say that there's no such thing as a climate refugee. The story is a little more complicated because there are instances when, not to get too technical, but there are instances when sort of the established reasons that countries would extend refugee protection to someone would also apply to people fleeing climate-related disasters. But those instances are really few, and so there's a need for a lot more law in this area. And another reason that there's a real need here is because climate we're seeing is now displacing more people than conflict. Just last year, climate and other climate-related and other environmental disasters forced 3 times the number of people to leave their homes than conflict and war. And that's been the case since 2008. So we're seeing that climate, the environmental degradation, the impacts Vic was talking about, are really forcing people to leave their homes. And we just don't have the legal infrastructure set up to address that. But to end on a more hopeful note and to answer the last bit of your question, which was what would I like to see? I think we're seeing some countries commit to, we say in the law, open, quote, regular migration pathways. What that just means is that to move away from this idea that we should be keeping people out and moving towards this idea where we should be making it easier for people to move about freely. And there are a number of justice issues related to that I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about later.
Great. That'd be fantastic to pick up on those. And thank you for that overview. It's so your point about contribution and impact and suffering is so true. It's across the board, as among and between nations and among and between generations and along all other kinds of axes of inequality as well, including race and class, even domestically in the United States. That's very, very helpful from both of you guys. One of the things that comes forward for me is how we need the law in order to press on the positive side, the liberatory side, toward just climate futures. We need the law to change, and it's a slow changing beast. And in both cases, Vic and Amma, you've highlighted the need for new legal understandings. And Brian, that's one of the things I'd like to ask you to give us a short overview of. What are the new things you see happening on this terrain of climate law and inequality, both positive and negative? How is the law starting to change, or what new developments are there? What stories do you and your team feel compelled to cover?
I mean, we find all sorts of stories to mine in the climate law space. And I think that's because at the end of the day, what you're looking at is, people might think lawsuits, courtrooms, dry procedural things, but the reality is, these are ready-made stories. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy, there's someone that's aggrieved, they want justice. And so there are no shortage of ways to dive into the climate lawsuit story. And there are, for better or worse, there are no shortage of climate lawsuits that have come about. So some of the ones that we found really interesting and that we've covered, certainly the Juliana case, just by ground of it being a path-breaking case featuring young adults, featuring kids, some of who have now become young adults. It's gone on so long. That in itself is a fascinating story. And so, that's something that we're really excited to dive into. More recently, the big case that happened last week, or I guess I should say last month, in the Netherlands was a case where Shell lost in a Dutch court. It was sued by a Dutch nonprofit and 17,000 citizens for not holding up its end of the bargain when it comes to climate change. And it didn't just lose that case, it lost in an incredibly, at least for Shell, catastrophic way. The judge basically said Shell had to reduce its emissions 45% by 2030. And those emissions were not just the ones from its activities of digging up oil and shipping them to market, but what's called Scope 3 emissions. So emissions from when people burn their oil. And that is by far the biggest share of emissions when it comes to oil. That's where the lion's share is being produced. So the fact that Shell was forced to take responsibility for those emissions is, it's just monumental. There's no way around it. It's one of the biggest rulings in climate law in, let's say ever, really. So to me, even though it's an international case, our audience skews American, but it's just one of those classic stories of, bad guy gets what's coming to them from a scrappy nonprofit and citizens that wanted to see their rights, served. They wanted to have their rights taken care of. So to me, yeah, those are some of the big stories. And it certainly is, seeing what readers get engaged with. They get this stuff. And it's not just about, these ideas of these cases alone, happening alone. Like, they're not sort of happening in a bubble. They're happening in concert with each other, feeding off each other. And really, at the end of the day, people understand that these institutions, whether it's Exxon or Shell, or whether it's the federal government in the US or any other government in the world, these institutions are not meeting the moment. Law, as you sort of mentioned in that quote, Miranda, it's not a logical process, because logic says we really need to draw down emissions by a very, very massive amount this decade, 7.6% a year, basically, for the next decade, and keep on going down thereafter. That's not happening, and it's because of these institutions failing people. So when I look at the coverage that we're doing, that's the kind of thing that I see as, really defining how we approach these stories, and really conveying the fact that this is an equity issue. These groups, if these institutions fail at their job, citizens, end users of these products, we all suffer at the end of the day. And so that, to me, is a really important facet to convey to readers. And the fact that people are reading this stuff indicates that they're starting to get this as well. So, those are the areas that I really see as exciting right now.
And a quick follow-up on that, Brian. Thank you very much for that. Are you seeing more reader interest in stories on climate law and inequality, or climate law in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say it depends on some of the context. Certain cases are maybe a little bit harder, especially when they're just getting the ball rolling. For example, in Guyana, there was a landmark case that was filed last month. It was a constitutional human rights claim about the impact of drilling in Guyana by Exxon and a couple other partners. And, we did a piece on that. It's a very early stage in the case where the suit got filed, and it didn't quite, I'd say, break through the way we'd hoped. But I think as these cases start to pick up steam, as more evidence comes out of the wrongdoing of these corporations, that's when you start to get readers involved, because they can really grasp onto, something that might seem a little bit vague in terms of constitutional rights, into like the actual, dynamics at play of good, wrong, bad, emissions, people being, fed a raw bill of goods. In the case of the Exxon case, that's a big part of it as well, is that they, they got a real sweetheart deal from the Guyana government, and that is hopefully not going to fly, depending on how courts, resolve the case. So I think as you get deeper into these cases and as you see victories come out, that's when people get really excited and want to read more.
That makes sense. And speaking of victories, in addition to the Shell case and a couple other things that happened 2 or so weeks ago, just in yesterday or the day before, the company behind Keystone dropped that pipeline project, which is the product of years of activism by indigenous water protectors and other climate activists, and also a lot of litigation that, among other things, simply slowed down the process for the company and gave the climate forward side time to win. Vic, you have recently been on the front lines earlier this week of the Line 3 struggle, which is one of the major pipeline struggles that's taking shape and that is going to define the next moment of climate activism. We want to take a break from our regularly scheduled programming, essentially just to get an update on that and on your experience there. And then, Brian, we'll come back to you to talk about how that connects with some other legal developments happening around oil company infrastructure and law enforcement, which, of course, is part of the law, and its differential application to different alleged violators of the law. But first, Vic, tell us about your experience on Line 3 and what's going on there.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a fantastic experience up there. And I was just there for this weekend, but actually the fight up there has been going on since last winter. People have been at protest camps up there, doing everything that they can, getting arrested, locking themselves up to equipment in the dead of northern Minnesota winter. And if you're not from the Midwest, that is tough. Is no joke. Yeah, this weekend was absolutely beautiful. There was a treaty peoples gathering, kind of under the context of trying to pull as many people in as possible to understand that we are all treaty people. Um, we are all living under the implications of treaties that our government signed with indigenous peoples that are being violated constantly and blatantly. Um, so over 2,000 people went up to northern Minnesota from all over the country. Even a few people from other countries were there, and basically stood up in the community and said, we cannot have Line 3. You're crossing over 20 rivers. You're crossing through indigenous treaty lands. You're putting wild rice crops at risk, which really support a lot of the people that are in that community. And not only that, but you're pumping tar sands from Canada through to U.S. states, Minnesota and Wisconsin. And not only that, but you plan on drilling under the Mississippi River at its headwaters, one of the largest rivers in the United States that sustains the life of millions of people. So that's kind of a lot of the context for why people even showed up there. And yeah, we had an amazing march. We had an awesome rally. We had a lot of people doing direct actions, shutting down pumping stations. It was actually definitely declared a day of victory because we shut down Enbridge's operations for an entire day. And that was really fantastic. And not only that, but we were really lucky to be able to create a new encampment right on the Mississippi River, where Enbridge has an easement, which just means they have some semi-ownership of this land to be able to build the pipeline through. And we were able to set up a camp right on the boards that they use to move their machinery in. And that was really exciting, and it's a really strategic point. And yeah, it was absolutely fantastic up there. There was also a lot of, not so great things going on. 150 people got arrested. The Department of Homeland Security sent a helicopter to do this really aggressive and violent dispersion tactic of getting close to the ground and stirring up a bunch of sand, basically soaked in oil, and sticks, and stirring all that up to try to disperse people. People were they used an LRAD device, which is a law enforcement weapon. Sorry if you hear my cat in the background, she's pretty needy. But they use an LRAD device, which is a law enforcement weapon. It's called a sonic weapon that literally makes this insanely loud noise. I can't even say loud. It gives people nauseousness, dizziness, confusion, in order to disperse the crowd. They use a lot of really violent tactics against some of the activists that were up there this week. But yeah, that's the fight that's going on up there. And later on, I'm going to speak more to maybe how you could plug in. But that's the brief that I got for everybody.
Thank you very much for that, for the live action report, and greetings to your cat. I wanted to give people a couple notes of context on that helicopter assault that you mentioned, Vic. One thing to note is that the self-same aircraft was used by the Department of Homeland Security in Black Lives Matter protests in Minneapolis, and after the murders of both George Floyd and Daunte Wright. I'll just leave that sitting there. Second is that it's a violation of very strict safety regulations that apply to helicopters. To use them in this way, they have to be high enough so they can be landed safely. So just underscores the point that I realize is a relatively obvious one, but it's always worth making. One of the key questions about the law is who has to follow it, and who gets who can flout it with impunity. That's one of its main substances. Is the question of enforcement. And so, Brian, I want to turn to you and ask you to put this in a broader context. You guys have been covering frequently developments around the protection of fossil fuel infrastructure and the statutory developments around that and the militarization of some police forces to defend against anti-pipeline and related protests. Can you give us an overview of what's been going on in the United States on that front?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very shocking thing, and it feels almost like an arms race amongst different states, as well as the federal government, to really sort of ratchet up the pressure on protesters. And I'll also add, I mean, we actually did a story, I guess it was late last year, on CBP, so Border Patrol, not just so Department of Homeland Security, which owned that helicopter that recently made news. They also, that's the agency that oversees the Border Patrol as well. And they flew drones over the George Floyd protests. And we actually did a story last year that focused on how one of those drones was also used to fly the route of the Keystone Pipeline, as well as parts of the proposed Line 3 pipeline, and circled over activists opposing the pipeline's house. So, Border Patrol denied that was the intent, but that was certainly, it was a stark flight path is what we'll say, and leave it at that. But in addition to, the federal government, there's also state government escalations as well. And what we've seen is these anti-protest laws. Of course, I guess law enforcement's going to go by while I'm talking about this. So basically, I'm not a legal scholar, so Miranda and Ahmad, leave up to you to maybe talk about this more in depth. But my understanding is that there are laws in the books to deal with protesters, whether it's trespassing, vandalism, or any other number of things, unlawful assembly, ways that can, if there are issues, the legal system seems equipped to handle protesters. But what states have done is really ratchet up the pressure on anti-fossil fuel protests in particular, passing what are called these critical infrastructure laws. And they're basically laws that are tailor-made to target protesting fossil fuel infrastructure, whether it's pipelines, power plants, refineries, whatever it might be. And it's been, like I said, a bit of an arms race. And recently, Montana, of all places, passed what is one of the most, if not the most, stringent anti-pipeline protest law in the country. This bill that passed the legislature and was signed into law gives folks that have been vandalized critical infrastructure, they can face up to $150,000 in fines and 30 years in jail. And for any organizations that have maybe taken part in this, whether it's a local nonprofit or indigenous group, they can face up to $1.5 million in fines if they're found to be held liable for this vandalism as well. So there's a really, really strong chilling effect on speech that these laws are meant to have, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels. And I think what's interesting about this, and the reason why you're seeing these laws is because, in the general public, what we're seeing is this huge backlash and opposition to fossil fuels and desire for climate action. It's being led by people like Vic that are out there on the front lines, whether it's suing the government or protesting at Line 3, but there's a general undercurrent in society that says we need to get off fossil fuels and we need to do it fast. And that's eroding the social license of these companies to operate. But there's one area where they still have a lot of influence, and that's in state legislatures. It doesn't take, in places like Montana, it doesn't take a big donation to make a difference to a state senator or representative to help them get over the line and get in the legislature. And this is particularly true of conservative Republican representatives and senators. It's not just them, but it's by and large, most of that money is going to them. And those are the people that are pushing through these laws. So that's the way basically that these companies are sort of circumnavigating, doing a little end around on the public, is instead of acquiescing to the public's interest, instead of letting the public having heavy influence on these lawmakers, what these companies are doing instead of getting out the vote for their policies is they're getting out the dollars and the checkbooks and turning over checks to these politicians. And so that's why you see these really extreme laws. And frankly, I mean, they pose a real danger to protesters on the ground, and they could silence dissent that is And at least in my opinion, that dissent to these projects is certainly warranted and something that lawmakers should be considering as they decide whether to approve these permits or not.
Right, so they can have the impact of making the projects look uncontroversial or even supported by local populations when the opposite is true. Another quick point I'll make on them that I know you've written about and thought about a lot. We recently submitted something to the UN on this from the Climate Museum with some other cultural organizations, is that because of where fossil fuel infrastructure is located, due to American white supremacy, which is to say on indigenous lands and in communities of color, the leaders and activists who are disproportionately targeted by these laws are leaders and activists of color. So there's an intensification of racist inequality that's built into these attacks on protests, which are on their face racially neutral as well. One point, an unstated premise of this in this conversation about anti-protest laws has to do with the role of this either replacement infrastructure or new infrastructure. And I'll just point out very quickly that it locks in to build a new pipeline or to rebuild one that's too rotten and old to use, locks in climate damage or locks in a huge amount of momentum toward climate damage. So in the case of Line 3, that's 750 plus barrels of oil per day over the life of the pipeline, where there will be a locked in momentum toward the delivery of that, when, as you're pointing out, Brian, what we need is the exact opposite, a very, very fast, ambitious, aggressive turn in the other direction toward clean energy as the source of energy that powers our economy. So just wanted to spell that out. That's what's at stake. That's part of what's at stake in these struggles over fossil fuel infrastructure, and part of why the oil industry puts so much into influencing and basically pocketing state legislators to make these laws happen. And both of you guys have referred some to the exchange between local and national dynamics. Amma, I wonder if you could take that question of scalar interaction and let us know how that works in your area of expertise, where you've both worked on sweeping questions of international law and also looked at the specific rights of specific island nations and other specific localities and state entities. How can we move forward with an understanding of what's happening at the local, at the national, and the international level on questions of climate displacement, on that form of climate inequality?
Sure. I think some of the exciting developments are coming at the local and national level. With the Mayors Migration Council, for example, a consortium of global mayors around the world who are saying cities are on the front lines of climate change when it comes to migration. And so we need to be preparing for welcoming climate migrants. And that work is, I think, in direct tension to some of the more xenophobic narratives that we sometimes see from certain national governments. But at the same time, I think here in the US, something that's exciting to me, although, with some limited, with some reserve, is President Biden's commitment to climate displacement in particular. President Biden issued an order that requires agencies in the U.S. to prepare a report to advise the U.S. government on how to let more climate displaced people into the U.S., which, as an advocate in this space, is just really exciting. And I guess I would say that at the national level, generally the story is that we have existing laws that can be used to extend protection to climate displaced people. We just need to actually use them. And where international law can really make a difference. International law can be really important, pushing us towards this side. We should be making it easier for people to migrate, as I mentioned when I first spoke, as opposed to more difficult to migrate. And we see this with the global a treaty that's called the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. that this is the first intergovernmentally negotiated agreement on migration ever. So the first time countries have come together around the world to negotiate and decide sort of what are our standards for treating. And that document and agreement, there are very clear steps to what national do to make sure that migrants are moving in a way that is dignified and supports their dignity and agency. But as Vic was saying earlier, treaties are nothing if they're not enforced, and I think that's where the cultural shift that needs to happen is really important. So what I mean by that is, I think a lot of the discourse and discussion that we see around migration is really centered on national security or in general. So there's this idea that, there's people coming into the US and other countries, and we need to stop this flow of people. And in this understanding, I think there's this idea that migration is a problem and migrants themselves are problems. But it's really important to understand migration as a response to the instability that people are facing across the world, rather than seeing migrants themselves as threatening. And to understand also that migration is a really natural phenomenon. Actually, really, people have been migrating throughout. It was actually really recent century that we began to sort of impose restrictions on how people move about. Although for us, maybe we think of it as really natural to sort of restrict how people move around the world, this is actually like a really recent phenomenon. And something that gives me hope about international law in particular is that there isn't this sort of security apparatus or this engine of violent enforcement that we see at the national level. So there's no, DHS helicopter coming in to enforce any international law. I mean, there's wars, but generally speaking, there isn't this allowance of the use of force in international law in the way that there is for domestic law. And what I think this means for international law, people actually have a lot of power to shift the law. And that's really, really, really important as we face these challenges where more and more people are having to leave their homes and are seeking safe places to be.
Thank you for highlighting all of that. Both human beings and other species are all about movement from their origins, right? And it's important to shift the framework to so that it encompasses that as part of the understanding. I really appreciate your making that point, Amma. Could you? We're going to do a lightning round to give everybody a heads up before we turn to our action ask in our closing on changes going forward that we'd like to see and that we'd like to ask our audience to join us in advocating for in a whole range of ways. And so, Amma, let me stay with you for a moment and ask, you've started to sketch this, but what changes would you like to see in the law of climate inequality, your specialty, migration?
I would love the US government to train immigration officers and judges to be able to recognize when climate displaced people should get refugee status. I think the law as it stands is expansive enough to provide some protection, but our immigration officials don't actually know how to consistently and properly apply the law. So I'd love the US government to start training our immigration officials in that way. And at the national scale, I would love more governments to actually take up some of these ideas in the Global Compact, which I mentioned, these tools that can actually be used to make it easier for people to move. More family visas, for example. As we try to shift a world where we let more people move around as they need to for climate-related reasons or whatever they might need to be, whatever reason they might need to be moving for.
Right. So sometimes we need to change a law either by eliminating it or by adding something. But sometimes what we have works, and it's just either the interpretation, the training of the infrastructure around it, and so on. Vic, that reminds me a little of Youth v. Gov, where our claim is the U.S. Constitution already holds implicitly the right to a livable future within it. And we just need the legal system to explicitly recognize that. So that's super helpful, Amma. Thank you. Brian, what do you want to see more of on the journalism side when it comes to, in your field as a whole, when it comes on climate law and inequality? What are you and your team looking at covering, and what do you want to see happen in the field?
It's a big question, and I think the things that I would love to see. I mean, I would love to see more of this coverage in general that doesn't just hew to process or keep it dry. But I think at the end of the day, the stakes are clear when it comes to climate change. And I think that making sure that is part of any coverage when it comes to climate lawsuit is really important. I also think it's really important to look at other lawsuits, or other, tussles in the legislatures that maybe not aren't climate based, but certainly have a component to that. So, for example, there's a big push for democracy reform, the For the People Act, H1, S1. It's a really important law to be considered by at the federal level as far as fixing democracy. So when it comes to that, I mean, it might not seem like a climate story off the bat, but I think that there is a climate angle to that story. Busy day on my street here, apparently. So I think it's really incumbent on climate reporters and political reporters to be able to look at things through that climate lens and see it for what it is. I mean, the protest laws that we've seen passed are a perfect example of very undemocratic laws that affect climate protest and fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think when we look at the bigger picture, I mean, climate policy, very popular on many, many fronts. And yet we're not seeing that happen at the federal level and in some cases at the state level. And so I'd love to see this democracy reform covered as a climate issue so that we have climate policies that reflect the will of the people as well and representatives that are willing to enact them. So that to me is what we're looking at that and we're trying to find ways to that. And I really would love to see other outlets do the same thing as well.
Excellent. I mean, in what you're saying about the kind of early and growing majority, all the polling backs that up. Huge support for renewables across the political spectrum, and fully 57% of American adults thinking that fossil fuel companies are responsible for the damages caused by climate change and wanting to see them held liable legally for damage to local communities. So democracy is completely bound up with these questions about climate in general, climate and inequality specifically. And I really appreciate your highlighting that. I'm going to ask everybody to stay up here because Amma and Brian, I know from prior research that you support this move that I'm about to make, which is to turn it over to you, Vic, to make an action ask of our audience, and to talk about how you think people who are eager to get involved but who maybe feel outscaled by the magnitude of the crisis or don't know where to begin, don't know how to feel like their action is meaningful, what steps can you urge us to take to join you and your fellow youth activists in Youth v. Gov to be helpful on line 3 and anything else that you'd like to put to us as a next step to take in moving forward together on climate?
Most definitely. First of all, I'll address for people who don't know how to get involved or get engaged, something that I always say, especially to other young people. I think in our world today, getting involved or engaged looks a lot of different ways. And I just like to say, you don't have to be a superstar to be an act. You don't have to have like a bunch of followers on Instagram or be in every Now This video or any of that. You just need to look at your community and look at your neighbors and look at the people who are around you and be like, what do folks need? Think about what you care about. Think about the things you enjoy. Think about the things that you want to protect. I think it's a lot of understanding, what's around you. And there's also a bunch of organizations all over the country that have chapter systems that are even maybe locally rooted. Sierra Club, Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, 0 Hour, Earth Guardians, the Alliance for Climate Education. These are all organizations that have chapters all over the country. And sometimes it's just, shooting someone an email. What are you guys up to? What are you working on? And also, like I said, it doesn't even have to be that. It could just be looking at who's next to you and who needs assistance. I think in the last year, we've seen a perfect example of how activism could look like so many things. It could look like mutual aid, um, you know, donating to a GoFundMe. All of those things are, even the word or activism or anything like that. It's just being more cognizant of all the places that you can help out. And for me, especially in the context of the climate crisis, especially in the context of people's environment, of people's climate, I think that's all very important. And then, in terms of call to action or something that you can do right now, or maybe could get plugged into right now. So like I said, the Treaty Peoples Gathering happened up this weekend in northern Minnesota, fighting against Line 3. There's going to be actions happening all summer. There's going to be protest camps up there all summer. Just like I said, they've been up there since December, but the fight is really raging on right now because they're trying to build this pipeline before the end of the year. So I think there's going to be a link dropped, treatypeoplegatherings.com/donate. I noticed that if you go on the mobile version, there will be like a list of a few things. If you go on the computer version, it'll just be a donate link. But there's 3 actions that could be beneficial to the movement up there. One, calling President Joe Biden. Which side is he on? What does he care about? He said he cared about climate, and he said he cared about people of color and indigenous treaty rights. So what can he do to actually stop this pipeline? You could also specifically mention Gina McCarthy in that call. I will just quickly say the number, but you could also find it very easily. The call the White House, it's 202-456-1111. My cat is coming, but
Your cat agrees.
So that's my cat agrees. So that is one action. 2, you could donate. Like I said, over 150 people got arrested. There is a really huge need for support in the bail fund. So you could donate. And if you donate too, it might not just go towards bail. There's people that have been sleeping in the woods in northern Minnesota for months. So there's a lot of needs. It might go towards blankets. It might go towards tents. It might go towards water gear. So that's another option. And then 3, you could come up to northern Minnesota. You could go to northern Minnesota. There's a lot of details on the Treaty Peoples Gathering website about different camps that are all over up there that are doing different actions, different levels of action. So, you don't have to be worried about being one of the 150 people arrested. There's a lot of things that need to go into the work, and it's not just, getting arrested. So those are 3 kind of action steps that I could give you right now to support what's going up at Line 3. It's a massively, massively important thing to be tapped into right now, and it's very not, I don't even want to say microcosm, but it's that's not the only place a pipeline fight is happening right now. But it's a place that's very, very worth noticing, and to get yourself in tune with the fact that there's a lot of fights that need to be happening across this country in terms to protect indigenous people, Black people, brown people against fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think that's my call to action for all of you.
That's fantastic, Vic. Thank you so much. So raise your awareness, raise your voice, and specifically on Line 3, there are a series of actions that Vic has laid out that all make great sense. I want to thank everybody who joined us today out there in the audience. It's been wonderful to know that you're out there taking this incredible conversation in. And to the people behind this incredible conversation, Vic, Amma, and Brian, thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful to discuss these issues with you, really instructive and a really great roadmap for some of the pathways forward. So many, many thanks. And we'll see all of you very soon. I want to close out very quickly. We're a little bit over time. with a note that we will be sending around a survey to everybody who can hear me now. And it really helps us a lot to get your feedback. It helps us improve our programming. So we hope you'll take a couple minutes to spin through that. If you'd like to be kept abreast of future programming, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. And that's climatemuseum.org. And finally, we hope that you'll tune in next month for Talking Climate Health. So a great conversation at the intersection of climate inequality and health, where we've confirmed Peggy Shepard, the founder and director of We Act, which is a nationally and internationally justly renowned environmental and climate justice organization in West Harlem, to be one of the people talking about that critical set of questions. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. And we'll see you next time.